Good afternoon. My name is Renee Ader, and I am a visiting provost visiting scholar in the Department of Africana Studies this academic year. Thank you for joining us for this conversation that is part of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. This is America series. Today's presentations are part of a group called Monumental Interventions, Projects from Africana Studies 0840 from the fall of 2020. So I thought I would begin by just shaping and telling you a little bit very quickly about how these presentations and monumental interventions came into being, and then proceed pretty quickly to the student presenters today. So this past fall, I taught a course entitled Monuments, History, and Memory at Brown University. This was a case study course in which we dealt with a group of monuments or individual monuments over the course of the semester. But we spent a lot of time wrestling with the idea of what is a monument and memorial, what is the difference between history and memory, and how these ideas play out in public monuments. The major assignment that the students completed over the course of the semester was based on a project first that I had done when I was a faculty member at the University of Maryland. That was a research project and presentation that asked students to conceive, research, and design a monument for the grounds of McKeldin Mall at the University of Maryland. And McKeldin Mall is the major green space at the university. So I had been having students create this kind of project in the past. And then over the summer of 22, Monument Lab in Philadelphia, which is a public art and history design studio, came up with this open source document called the Monument Lab Field Trip. So the students worked through the worksheet looking at monuments and the monumental landscape, and they also designed their own monuments designed their own monuments or created interventions into the monumental landscape. So today we have four presenters. Miya Matsuishi-Elhardt will talk about her intervention entitled The Great Work Tree. Then we will hear from Ciara Sing with her Acknowledgment Garden. We will move next to Noah Howard, who has designed a project entitled Providence Slave Trade Memorial and Museum. And we will end with Avery Oliver, who has created an intervention into Kennedy Plaza in Providence entitled We Dream a World. So we will begin with Miya. I'm sorry, Miya, I put the wrong initial in there, but Miya, I'm sorry about that. I can't believe I put an A instead of an I. But Miya, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor Ader. My name is Miya. I am a sophomore at Brown. And so my intervention is titled The Great Work Begins, or The Great Work Tree. I did my project on the National AIDS Memorial Grove in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is where I'm from. So I'll just get right into it. The National AIDS Memorial Grove is a space in the southeast corner of Golden Gate Park. It's 10 acres. It's nestled in this giant green space that is in San Francisco. It was dedicated in 1996 by a bill that was introduced by Nancy Pelosi and signed by Bill Clinton. So you might see this is a quote by him on the main plinth here, and there are a lot of different references to specifically Clinton and Pelosi throughout the park. It's kind of an unusual green space. It's a dell, so it's sort of in almost like a bowl. There are several pathways that you have to walk down, kind of steep, or sometimes there's stairs into this kind of inset space, which makes it really unusually serene and quiet. You can't hear noise from street level or hear cars. It's sort of easy to forget that you're in the middle of a bustling city, which makes it a great place, I think, to be a memorial. And there's lots of open field spaces, rocks that are almost like headstones a little bit, but that are in tribute to people who have passed on. And then kind of the central space for memorialization, which is what I focused on, is the Circle of Friends. You can see how it's sort of set back into the grove here. And the Circle of Friends is a large piece of Minnesotan flagstone. It's surrounded by dogwood trees and is inscribed with this series of dizzying concentric circles of text. This represents 2,500 names chosen by donors to the grove, many of whom lost a loved one to the AIDS epidemic. So this is still like an active memorial site. People leave fresh flowers. You often see mourners visiting, but it's also definitely a community gathering space. I noticed while I was there, there was a family having a birthday party, and people really use the space just similar to any other public park. It's gorgeous, it's very peaceful, but I think visiting in 2020, particularly in the context of this project, there are aspects of this memorial space that feel a little bit off to me that I tried to address with an intervention. So when I first started thinking about how I wanted to approach this project, I asked myself a question that we talked about a lot in this course, which is whose stories are not recognized in the space. Because I think for a lot of interventions, we focus on sort of countering a problematic narrative. So the memorial is honoring someone like a Confederate soldier who perhaps should not be honored in a public space. And here, I think it was a little bit more complicated in terms of whose stories might be obscured by the memorial work that is going on here. And so the first example that was really overwhelming to me is just how kind of apolitical the space is. I think as the COVID pandemic rages on, AIDS activism and Reagan's inability to protect marginalized communities have become really relevant. And this history is largely absent from the Memorial Grove. One would not know from visiting the site alone that the AIDS epidemic disproportionately affected communities like the LGBT community, communities of color, and one does not really get a sense of how or why the epidemic lasted as long as it did. Many people who are honored in this grove spent the final years of their lives demanding justice and equal protection from the American government to refuse to acknowledge their humanity or their suffering. And I think those stories really aren't here. You just have kind of a name on this rock. And I think COVID has really shown, like the vaccine is a great example, the power of like government recognition to really kind of move things along in terms of research and treatments. And Reagan didn't even say AIDS until 1985 after many people had already passed. And so I think that was a piece that I thought was really missing that I wanted to bring back into this space. Another thing that I think is really interesting is that the stone, unlike a lot of other memorials in which it's sort of everybody who's passed on is recognized in some way, the stone is sort of the names inscribed are chosen by donors. And so it doesn't have to be someone who's passed on, even though that's technically what the space is for. And so this, I think, has two effects. One, like working class communities affected by the epidemic are effectively erased because it costs at least $1,000 to be recognized anywhere in the grove. And also, if you look long enough at the circle, and hopefully you can see in this image, there are corporate names as well inscribed here. So I think here's Levi Strauss on the bottom here, Pacific Bell, Chevron is kind of this last name. And I think to have kind of corporations inscribed on this like stone that's devoted to memorializing people who passed on is inappropriate at best and offensive at worst. I visited this space with my mother, who lost many people who she was very close to sort of growing up in San Francisco during this period. And we kind of talked a little bit about how almost hurtful it was to see those corporate names there, especially since I think so much of the AIDS crisis was defined by silence and inaction from the government, from people in power. And so to see these names here in this space that's supposed to be paying tribute to people felt really inappropriate to me, or to both of us. And I think when I thought about what I wanted to do, I think there can sometimes be resistance to sort of putting political messaging or having sort of an activist purpose to a space that's supposed to memorialize someone. But in this class, we studied the Vietnam War Memorial and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice. And I think both of these were really important for me in terms of how they were able to address kind of the complexity and also the preventability of the deaths that they memorialize. That it's possible to honor people in a way that I think is really genuine and important, and that is sort of helpful to families, that really validate people's experience, while also paying tribute to the fact that these deaths were preventable, and had someone taken action, this memorial would perhaps not even have to be here. So I came up with this intervention, which I alternately call The Great Work Begins and The Great Work Tree. That line is from Angels in America by Tony Kushner, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. This intervention aims to bring community voices into the Grove and honor everyone who lost their lives, regardless of status or financial means. It's composed of natural materials, and it houses a living tree with the goal of blending into the natural environment of the Grove. And it also emphasizes the growing and changing story of the AIDS epidemic. So it includes a wooden base that serves as an area where people can sit, which is kind of at the bottom here. A LED display that is regularly updated with names submitted by visitors, and speakers that will play oral histories, speeches, and other sounds related to this sort of historical event. When I was designing this, I was really inspired by Boogie Down Booths, which is a public art project by Chet Travieso in the Bronx neighborhood of New York City. It was erected at a subway station, and these booths offer passengers a place to sit and wait for the train, but they're also equipped with speakers that play music inspired by the cultural heritage of the neighborhoods in which they're placed. So they played music from the Dominican Republic, from Ghana. They play like American music, just whatever is sort of popular to the community, and sort of pays tribute to people's heritage. It encourages people to come together, to listen, and to interact. And I think it really brings the cultural identity of the neighborhood into the built environment, which I think is really cool. It provided people with a community gathering space. And I think by sort of incorporating this piece into what I designed, I was hoping to kind of encourage people to interact with one another within the memorial space, while also paying tribute to lives that were lost. So basically, here, I'll switch to my SketchUp model so we can kind of look at it from multiple angles. So I sort of took inspiration on the bottom here to have like a bench-like piece, and then ideally people would come together, sit down, and then the central block features like QR codes that can be scanned. If I scan it, they can be kind of visible. And that would basically take people to a landing page where you can submit a name or sort of record a short story or clip of audio. And over time, this piece would be these pieces of audio would be added to kind of a working playlist that is played by these directional speakers here. So some of them would be oral histories or kind of significant segments of audio, and then some of them are just contributed by visitors. So this allows kind of all people who visit, regardless of whether or not they make a donation, to contribute a name, to contribute their own little piece of the history, and really just allows everyone to feel as though they are recognized. And this is partially inspired by the 2020 World AIDS Day installation at the New York National AIDS Memorial. Which similarly featured a different playlist of oral histories and took place during the COVID pandemic, so allowed people to come together outside and learn about this history. So I tried to kind of take that idea and add a more interactive element so more people can feel as though they are like involved and seen by the space. A little bit more on the name. You can see some of the quotes here. The name is drawn from the final line of Angels in America by Tony Kushner, which was a really groundbreaking play about the epidemic and about kind of like queer life in the 1980s. And this final passage, which I've written out here, says, "This disease will be the end of many of us, but not nearly all, and the dead will be commemorated and will struggle on with the living. And we are not going away. We won't die secret deaths anymore. The world only spins forward. We will be citizens. The time has come. I bless you, more life. The great work begins." So I chose to inscribe the blocks, or that central block on the side here, with bits of that text, because I think this quote really kind of encapsulates the spirit of the Memorial Grove and also what I was trying to do with this piece. I think the purpose of the space is to honor those who have passed, but also to give the living a space to gather and reflect. I also think, although it doesn't say so explicitly, the use of plural pronouns is a subtle nod to the LGBT community, which was disproportionately affected by this virus. And the phrases "we will be citizens" and "silent deaths" gesture to the ways in which victims were oppressed and dehumanized and silenced during this epidemic. And I also like the way that this quote frames the memorial space as a beginning rather than just a marker of death. I think one thing that kind of bothers me about the space as it is that it really only honors these people sort of at the moment that lives were lost, rather than talking about the vibrancy of their lives or the activist work that they did to sort of be recognized and to sort of improve the lives of other people who were sick. And so I think by framing this kind of tree as a space where conversations will start, where people will gather and will work, where work will begin on memorializing and sort of remembering people who have passed and kind of applying their stories and sort of honoring them and applying their stories to our own lives, especially amidst COVID, where we've seen how kind of disproportionately this disease has affected different communities. I think to be able to learn lessons from what had happened, to honor people, and also to kind of come together as a community in this space, even though it is a space of mourning and a space of grief. That's really what I hope this intervention will do. So I will pass it on to the next presenter, but thank you so much for listening. I'll stop sharing. Yeah, on to Ciara.
So thank you, Ciara. I just want to say one thing to the folks who are attending. If you have any questions about the interventions that you're seeing, or any questions about the projects of the class, please drop your questions into the Q&A. We'll have a period of about 20 minutes afterwards to talk about what you've seen here today. So thank you. And Ciara Sing is next.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ciara Sing, S-I-N-G, there's no H. I'm a current junior double concentrating in education and urban studies, and through Professor Ader's class, I was inspired to do an intervention on Brown University's campus with the Caesar Augustus statue located in front of the dining hall. And just for a little bit of background, I was inspired to take Professor Ada's class, not only because of the political debate around monuments and their place in future society, but because of the way space, and particularly Black space on campus, are constantly being contested. And so I knew I wanted to specifically do an intervention on campus because I realized that the historically Black spaces on campus, such as the Harambe House, the Brown Center for Students of Color, and the Slavery Memorial, are constantly under attack and in question, but monuments such as this one that I'm about to present on has a white supremacy legacy are allowed to be untouched and unquestioned for the sake of just future conversations. So today I'm going to be doing an overview and talking about the intervention details and talk a little bit more about my intervention. And on the bottom is a picture of the Caesar Augustus spread featured in Brown Monthly Alumni. And so in Professor Ader's class, we learned about the power that monuments hold, their intentional manipulations of material, space, and perspective that permeate the complex aspect of history. And so they render this idea of communal memory, and therefore they hold this idea of validity and power. And monuments such as this and statues represent values and ideas that should withstand through the test of time. So I asked myself, what are the roles of Roman statues on Brown University's campus? And currently, Brown University's campus does not reflect the values that should be projected into the future. And so the Caesar Augustus statue has been at the center of major campus conflicts for the past few years. And so this statue is being protected by a few individuals that hold immense power, and monuments are unique because they have a level of mutability, that I hope through my intervention rests and holds into conversation with this idea of collective value. And prior to doing that, just a brief historical context. So a little over 100 years ago in 1906, the bronze statue Caesar Augustus was first dedicated in front of the Rhode Island Hall on the main green, which you can see on the left. And Moser Goddard gifted the bronze replica to the original marble one in Rome. And at the dedication, which you can see in the bottom pictures, President Fonts accepted the gift and emphasized its distinctive value to Brown's campus. He said it represents one of the finest specimens of manhood and physical development of any age. He stated that the statue serves as a reminder of art and literature, an age where both were at their best. So over the years, the statue became a physical symbol of Brown University, so much so that the university ended up selling postcards with the image of the statue on it. And so the statue ended up proving inability to withstand the test of time because its right hand was taken off during the storm, but then they fixed it, but then it fell off again a year later. And in a few years, it was moved to the Riston Quad, which you can see on the right. And Henry Riston, Brown past president, called the Riston Quad a tool for social engineering. And he wanted a space for students to have different groups and backgrounds could live and eat together. And so he deemed the statue as a necessary, crucial part of that. And so the Caesar Augustus statue represents this historic power and elitism at Ivy League universities. And over time, its collective identity held that broader dominant narrative that gets centered at predominantly white institutions. So as the statue gets passed through multiple university presidents, it continues to exist on campus despite leadership. So its values of white supremacy and colonialism have influenced the culture on campus. And his history of warfare and colonialism has an entanglement with Brown University's own foundation. And so the Caesar Augustus statue is not a politically neutral artifact. It endorses imperialistic values and exclusion. And naturally, very similar statues have been taken down, destroyed, or transformed into counter monuments. And so I hope that I can do that with my own. And I think it's important to recognize the way in which space, power, and monuments are intertwined. And so monuments actively shape public memory and dictate an individual's relationship to space historically, and also who is currently allowed within that space. And so it's important to note that the harm not only comes from the statue, but the space itself, and it's highlighted in its relationship between Brown University's own campus and the harm that it's done for Black individuals and Indigenous communities, and also the harm that has done on the land. So on the left is a detailed map of who and what used to occupy the Providence and specifically the east side. So the statue sits on native Narragansett land, as well as Brown University and other parts of Rhode Island that occupy ritual land of the Narragansett and Wampanoag tribes. In the center is an archive showcasing the construction of the Riston Quad. Henry Riston, who was a past president, like I said, called it for a tool for social engineering, but in order to do that social engineering, he displaced many families and destroyed 51 buildings, including homes, shops, and schools. And on the right is an image from the Harambe House archives of a student documenting a racist incident that occurred at the site of the monument. She shares a narrative of her walking to a meeting. She gets hit with multiple snowballs, and it's called a racialized slur that I've highlighted in red, but I'm not going to say out loud. And so then she attempts to report it to the university, but was denied justice and later explained some of the racial harm and violence that occurred there is protected by the university. So she says, maybe racial slurs and ice balls will force the president to tell the truth. We cannot let the administration get away with sweeping this under the rug. And so I highlight these narratives because it's a controversy greater than Roman statues. It's important to recognize the harm that they have and the harm that echoes within the land and space of monuments. And so the trauma still exists around the statue and still exists within the nature. And speaking of nature, for my intervention, I was particularly inspired by the University of Maryland's Garden of Reflection and Remembrance. It is an interfaith garden and labyrinth that rests in the heart of campus, and I was struck by the garden's ability to both incite individual reflection around loss, but at the same time catalyze unity in a way that isn't exclusionary. And so the garden manipulates nature and design, emphasizing solace amongst chaos. And I was particularly sparked by the journal project because the level of engagement has the possibility to do a cultural shift. So these pictures are thanks to Professor Ader when she took her previous class, one of her previous classes there. And they have a journal project that is weatherproofed, and different people can write their reactions and their response to deal with some of these beliefs and ideologies. And so in thinking about my intervention, I wanted to create something that wrestled with harm and trauma and moved towards healing in a way that was mutually respectful to both the land, the nature, and the statue. So a design that honored public space, but pushed for a more truthful narrative of beliefs of power, diversity, and culture to this broader community. So for my intervention, I wanted to create something universal, unlike the Caesar Augustus statue, and I knew it needed to be something that through time would just be as effective for the ever-changing demographics of Brown University. So I chose the idea of the garden because it's timeless and does not specifically praise one value. It also allows a way to acknowledge the sacred indigenous land and many Black laborers who built Brown passed through Brown or are negatively impacted by Brown University. And so I wanted to focus on sustainability and how we are giving and receiving the land. I was interested in designing a design that will withstand the test of racial chaos and all of campus's values. So I wanted to transform Bristol Quad into a place of solace despite the space historically being the center for racial harassment and hazing. And so the garden is inspired by swirling details seen in multiple Rhode Island Narragansett tribes, specifically a turtle that they use, and that could be seen on the bottom right-hand side, as well as like there's more in-depth details. And so the 4 separate spirals are connecting into one main circle. And as you can see on the image, represent the north, south, east, and west, but the pathway of the spirals are made up of stones and a few of the Rhode Island native flowers, such as the spotted cranesbill, which is the purple one, the golden groundsel, eastern blue-eyed grass, and tall meadow rue, which is the white flower, leading into a small pool of water at the center of the design. So inside the center of the design, there are small pools of water as well as 3 monolith-like triangular structures made of polished Black marble, both to represent the idea of the past, present, evolving into the future, as well as honoring Brown University's legacy with the transatlantic slave trade. And scattered along the edge of the circular pool and pathway are the native flowers that I mentioned before. So it's intended that it doesn't require as much upkeep and the rainwater can be used to water the plants. So of course it will shift through the seasons, but a sustainable design and use of terrain should aid the garden in withstanding all weathers. At the other end of the spiral, there are 4 stone slab benches. And so I wanted to include the benches because it's a visual cue for students and visitors to take a moment to physically and mentally immerse themselves into the space. And this is just a physical rendering of it to show like around the space. And lastly, in class, we learned that monuments and statues represent values and ideas that should stand the test of time, which means that we need to honor the brutal legacy of slavery and displacement in land and the ongoing modern racism that exists on campus. And so I wanted to use the design of the garden because not only does it beautify the land that already has so much trauma upon it, I'm hoping that the native designs incite personal reflection for students to consciously think about how their trajectories ties with this oppressive history at Brown, and what are they going to do about it, and how are they going to transform the space and harm. And so with my intervention, I attempt to acknowledge Brown's history and attempt to create an art piece that inspires people to confront the pain and think about the role that they have in Brown's legacy. Because Brown's history will always be there, but it's important to show how are we reconciling with it and honoring it and moving towards a better future. And so we need to publicly recognize it. And I hope that the garden inspires students and faculty to move beyond the diversity action plans in like meaning and unique ways and move beyond their time here at Brown. So that is it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ciara, very much. Noah, you are the next speaker.
Can everyone see that? So my name is Noah Howard, and this is the Providence Slave Trade Memorial and Museum, which I designed for this class in the fall semester. So this presentation discusses the sale of enslaved people. I want to make that really clear. This is a history that is really raw and important. It is important, but it's also very raw and can be upsetting. So I want to get that out there. So despite boasting a really dense memorial landscape, Providence is really notably lacking in any sort of monument or memorial or commemorative effort that focuses on Black and Indigenous histories. In the 18th century, Rhode Island emerged as a financial hub of the transatlantic slave trade. In 1777, Newport was the continent's most active slave trading port. And in the same year, more than a sixth of white Providence households owned at least one slave. The discrepancy between slavery's historical ubiquity in Rhode Island and the contemporary invisibility of these crimes allows for a process of forgetting that has really continued into the modern day, and really augments the urgency of creating and commemorating these crimes and the victims of these crimes, so that these things are made visible. While developing my proposal, I felt very strongly that the memorial's physical location should be closely connected to the work's context. Specifically, rather than reimposing the violence of the slave trade, I wanted to return viewers to the existing yet conveniently erased sites of the slave trade within Providence, so that they could be witnesses to these historical crimes. Contemporary vernacular memory of slavery most frequently places it at Market House, which is a building that sits at the base of College Hill. These geographic associations have been reproduced and reinforced by student organizers at Brown and RISD, who have tirelessly advocated for the erection of a permanent memorial in the square. While Market Square dominates contemporary vernacular memory, historical descriptions don't really point to the public sale of enslaved people as happening within a centralized location. Instead, they suggest that these transactions were more often located in decentralized locations or in private establishments. In order to identify these sites, I looked through hundreds of advertisements for the purchase and sale of enslaved people that were posted in Providence's colonial newspaper, the Providence Gazette. A combined tavern and inn owned and operated by colonist Richard Olney in the late colonial and post-revolutionary periods featured prominently in these advertisements. Olney's business occupied a two-story wooden building along the western side of what is now known as North Main Street. Between 1760 and 1780, the business is cited more than any other location as the site of public auction or sale of enslaved people within Providence. Having identified it as a local center of the domestic sale of enslaved people, I really wanted to locate Olney's business. Using primary source maps and secondary source descriptions, I was able to place the business within the current bounds of the Roger Williams National Memorial, a park administered by the National Park Service, which sits at the base of College Hill. With the help of an archaeological resource study published by Professor Rubertone of the Anthropology Department in 1981, I was able to locate the site's location more specifically. Here it is. And here it is within the bounds of the Roger Williams National Memorial on the western side of North Main Street at the base of College Hill. While Olney's Tavern hosted the majority of public sales of enslaved people that I had identified from the adverts, the vast majority of these advertisements instruct interested parties to inquire of the printing office, indicating a private sale brokered by the printer. According to historian Jonathan E. Taylor, printer-brokered slave sales, comparatively common in New England, facilitated the continuity of slavery to fit the changing needs of enslavers. Print advertisements enabled individual slaveholders to easily resell enslaved people when their ownership became unprofitable. This allowed enslavers to recoup much of their initial investment or even turn a profit on the sale of enslaved people. This type of sale appears to have constituted the vast majority of domestic slave sales within Providence between the year 1760 and 1790. So this sort of led me to the next question: who are the printers that are brokering these sales? So the answer to this question led me to the John Carter House at 21 Meeting Street, which sits along the side of College Hill. Built in or before 1772, this house is the original printing location of the Providence Gazette, which was the largest and for a long time the only colonial newspaper in Providence. In the building's basement, printer and enslaver John Carter and his business partner William Goddard published hundreds of notices advertising the sale of enslaved people and offering rewards for their recapture of those who had escaped bondage. In designing a memorial space, I sought to create a site that addressed the diverse and often seemingly conflicted needs of Black and white visitors. I ultimately took cues from the memorial architecture of the Holocaust, which similarly addresses questions of how to address traumatic histories in a way appropriate to victims, collective perpetrators, and uninvolved third parties alike. I settled on an approach exemplified by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. These memorials link spaces of education with those of remembrance through rigid spatial itineraries. At both sites, visitors begin by traveling through an interpretive museum that deals honestly with the context and history of the genocide at hand. Visitors ultimately arrive at one or more memorial spaces where they are able to process, remember, and reflect. My proposed memorial, while different in subject and aesthetic identity from those mentioned here, is intended to function similarly. By requiring visitors to follow an interpretive itinerary, I also hope to separate the reflection space from the mundane, heightening its identity as a sacred site and allowing for a vulnerability that viewers may otherwise feel uncomfortable with. My memorial site links the John Carter House at 21 Meeting Street with the site of Richard Olney's Tavern in the current bounds of the Roger Williams National Memorial. Indicative of the compact nature of the colonial city of Providence, the two sites stand less than 500 feet from one another, which really allows for them to be connected. So the area between these sites is intended to function as an interpretive space while the latter exists as a memorial site. Visitors enter the memorial through the basement of the John Carter House. The building is currently owned and operated by the Providence Preservation Society, an organization that which, through a colonial revival and a series of commemorative plaques, promotes a greenwashed and conveniently raceless history of this building. Measured drawings of the house, produced as part of the Historic American Building Survey in the 20th century, also identify portions of the cellar as a probable slave pit. Those are their words. Ostensibly the living spaces of the three people that John Carter enslaved. By establishing the building's basement as the entrance to my memorial, I intend to resituate the slave past as a history inextricable from the way that we perceive the site today, as well as complicated histories that through revision and omission have been made ahistorically simple. Via the basement, visitors enter a 700-foot-long subterranean corridor. As they move along the length of the hall, they are presented with interpretive offerings which detail the history of the slave trade within Providence. In addition to referencing the subterranean sites in which enslaved residents of Providence were forced to live, the underground portion of the space asserts that the slave past is an indissoluble piece of Providence, despite efforts to render the history invisible. Although this portion of the memorial functions firstly as an interpretive space, its design carries numerous aesthetic connotations. First of these is the materiality of the space. Concrete supported glass walls allow for the visitors to view the earth that lies below the city's surface, making material the process of bearing witness to the past. Additionally symbolic are numerous corners where the corridor abruptly turns at acute and non-standard angles. This zigzag layout symbolizes the back and forth movements of slaving voyages across the Atlantic Ocean. The unpredictable nature of the space is also intended to deprive visitors of a feeling of agency, representing the capricious violence to which the victims of the slave trade were subjected to. After traversing this interpretive corridor, visitors arrive at a square memorial chamber, which functions as a site of reflection and remembrance. The space is located under the site once occupied by Olney's Tavern, where an unknown number of people were bought and sold into slavery in the 18th century. Benches along the room's periphery invite visitors to pause and occupy the space. Two quotes engraved on the chamber's walls provoke introspection. The first of these, from James Baldwin's essay, Many Thousands Gone, reads, quote, "As is the inevitable result of things unsaid, we find ourselves until today oppressed with a dangerous and reverberating silence." The second, by author Ta-Nehisi Coates, reads, "An America that looks away is ignoring not just the sins of the past, but the sins of the present and the certain sins of the future." At the center of the room stands a massive concrete cube, which extends from the floor through the ceiling of the space. The ceiling does not meet the block. Instead, a small gap is present between the two. Through this opening, water flows along the sides of the cube, while light filters into the otherwise unlit room. While the monolith recalls the form of an auction block, it is difficult to parse this semblance from within the space. Instead, the block appears as a central square column firmly rooted in the ground. After exiting the subterranean chamber via a ramp, visitors seek to reorient themselves and attempt to understand the route they took to arrive at their current location. In this process of reorientation, visitors re-encounter the above ground portion of the monolith as the only aspect of the memorial itinerary visible from street level. Above ground, the visible portion of the cube appears as a low rectangular fountain. Like an infinity pool, water laps over the edges of the cube and runs down the block sides into the chamber below. From this spot, the fountain resembles the foundation of a building, implicitly prompting viewers to reconsider the ongoing influence and relevance of slavery and its remnants. There are a number of symbolic intentions behind the form of the monolith. Chief among these is the cube as a visual reference to the auction block. Perhaps more subtle, yet nonetheless key to understand the memorial, is the symbolic connotation behind the block's position. By placing the majority of the cube below ground, I intend to visually suggest that the block had, at one time, been entirely above ground, yet had since sunk into the earth. The implication of time, yet lack of visible deterioration on the surface of the block suggests that, while possible to obscure or render it invisible, The slave past is an inextricable part of Providence's landscape that must be acknowledged and confronted. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Noah, for that. Very much appreciated. So we will move to our final presentation this afternoon, and that will be Avery Oliver and her intervention into Kennedy Plaza. And you have plenty of time. And we do, if you have questions, feel free to post them. So Avery, you're up.
Thank you, Professor Ader. Okay. So I'm going to be presenting on the Soldiers and Sailors Monument located in downtown Providence, and my intervention is called We Dream a City. So first, I'm going to give some background on the monument and its message, and then I'll get into my intervention on the monument. So it was dedicated in 1871 to the 1,727 Rhode Islanders who sacrificed their lives during the Civil War, and you can see the text that they put on the monument.
Hey, Avery, are you going to share the screen so we can see?
Oh no, I forgot.
No problem. No problem. Let's just pull it
up. Okay. Thank you so much. All right. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to be presenting on the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. It's located in Kennedy Plaza and is adjacent to Providence City Hall. So first I'm going to give some, okay, I already said that. So it was dedicated in 1871 to about 1,700 Rhode Islanders who sacrificed their lives during the Civil War, and you can see this on the left. The Rhode Island Black Heritage Society added a plaque to the monument on the right that honors the 14th Rhode Island Heavy Artillery Regiment for Black men in particular, and so the plaque that they added is on the right. The monument stands 40 feet high and was constructed of granite sourced from westerly Rhode Island, showing how the monument's really meant to represent Rhode Island as a state and Providence more specifically. Atop the memorial is an 11-foot figure meant to represent the United States, and 4 7-foot-tall figures directly below it each represent a separate branch of the U.S. military. The monument displays 4 bronze reliefs of allegorical women, and I'm only showing 3 on the screen, who each symbolize war, victory, peace, and freedom. During the monument's dedication ceremony, veterans marched down the streets of downtown Providence and Exchange Place was filled with spectators. The event was described to be pretty lively just because of how involved everyone was in the monument's purpose and the end of the war. Reverend Augustus Woodbury delivered an oration that honored not only the bravery and valor of the veterans and their families, but also highlighted the patriotic and unifying message of the monument. Although he didn't specifically acknowledge the Black soldiers who fought in the war, he does mention slavery a bit. However, he assumed that national unity would be effortlessly restored despite the moral divide on the basis of race. His speech mentions the idea of embracing difference and equality, which do contribute to the overall meaning of the monument, but I think that these ideals are really second to patriotism and nationality. Today, the space doesn't seem to engage the public in reflection on the intended meaning of the monument. When I visited Kennedy Plaza in October, and I'm sure a lot of you have also walked through it if you're from Providence, I saw that a lot of people used the memorial as a resting place and sat in its steps, unaware of its historical significance. I think that monument should really allow people to engage with memory and history, and this monument doesn't currently serve that purpose. The City of Providence is currently fundraising to renovate the monument and the space immediately surrounding it by adding a low fence, benches, and a few tables. These renovations will also consist of physical renovations of the monument, such as refurbishing the stone and bronze, cleaning the existing plaques, making new cannonballs, and repairing the lighting of the monument. However, I don't think that like a fresh coat of paint and a few pieces of furniture aren't really going to effectively allow the monument to deeply engage with the space and the community that now occupies Providence. So looking back at the dedication and its public engagement, it seems clear to me that the message of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument really needs to be reevaluated and reinvigorated with the goal of heightening public interaction. The monument doesn't currently exist as a living monument because it solely holds meaning in the context of 1871. And I think that that idea is really important when I was thinking about my intervention. So an intervention should really connect with present day narratives and concerns, highlighting its original message of equality and changing its nationalistic message to a more inclusive one of unity. Not only should this intervention engage the public, but also project a broader message of equality by incorporating Indigenous and Black narratives from the Providence community. This is a picture of Kennedy Plaza, which I think a lot of people see as the heart of downtown Providence, and is also the home of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. And it's not in this picture, but it's like towards the left side of this picture. The city of Providence, Rhode Island was founded in 1636 by Roger Williams, who was fleeing religious persecution in Massachusetts. The land was previously occupied by the Narragansett and Wampanoag tribes, whom European settlers fought during King Philip's War in 1675. And so sorry. As a result of the war, thousands of Indigenous people were killed while others were captured or sold into slavery. Something that we really discussed in class last semester was how monuments really need to address socio-historical context and marginalized experiences, which are even demonstrated in Providence by the profound economic and racial segregation of it. And so I have this map here, and so the blue represents communities that are predominantly white, and then the red and pink represents communities of color. And so I just wanted to show this to kind of represent how inequality definitely exists in Providence through segregation. And so it can even be seen when walking through Kennedy Plaza. The bus terminal is predominantly occupied by people of color, while like the train station, for example, is predominantly white. And even like a couple blocks down the street is predominantly white. So it's interesting how spaces are just kind of very concentrated in Providence. So now I'm going to talk, so the intervention should present a broader question about what equality looks like today, especially to Indigenous communities and people of color living in Providence. So I'm gonna move a little bit into my intervention now, using kind of all of these ideas of equality and community and reflection that I thought about when like studying the history of the monument. So my intervention, entitled We Dream a City, will feature 8 mosaic benches that encircle the statue. Langston Hughes's poem, I Dream a World, will be a central feature of the new space, as each bench will be dedicated to a portion of the poem. The name of the intervention references the poem, its message of looking towards an equal future, and the role that the Providence community can play in envisioning it. Starting from the design process, the monument will engage the community to highlight Black and Indigenous voices. And so 4 groups, including 3 middle schools and 1 community center, will design the mosaic panels. Each of the 4 groups will be responsible for 2 benches, utilizing assigned portions of the poem to envision and design 2 separate mosaics. Through this process, they'll reflect on their own definitions of equality, as well as equality in the context of the Providence community. It'll allow the message of equality to live on in this space and kind of be recreated a little bit and engage other members of the community as they traverse it. So to address all these different aspects of the intervention, I think it would be a good idea to add a plaque to the east side of the statue that'll describe the intervention's intentions and the community groups that helped envision the project, just to give credit for everyone who helped to work on it. So now I'm going to go into more detail on, I think, the main 4 aspects of my intervention. So the poem, the benches, the mosaic, and the idea of community engagement more broadly, and then specifically in this intervention. So the poem I Dream a World by Langston Hughes speaks to the idea of equality and community reflection that I want this intervention to really speak about. And I put the poem on this slide, but I'm not going to read it out, but you all can kind of look over it while I keep talking. It details his visions for an equal future for all and uses natural imagery. This poem's style and imagery make it really effective inspiration for community members to reflect on equality and creative representation. So I divided the poem into 8 segments, each representing a different aspect of the world that Hughes dreams. So for example, one segment, I Dream a World Where All Will Know Sweet Freedom's Way, would be written in bronze lettering on the outside of the southmost bench. And so just for that example, it was like section C would correspond to bench C, and then it would be the same for all of the 7 other letters. A community group would reflect on this line's meaning and design a mosaic panel inspired by it. So using this poem in Redream a City would allow reflection and bring the monument into the present. The next, I think, central part of my intervention is the idea of like benches and seating. So benches really bring people together and allow for reflection, and I really wanted to bring that into my intervention. So one example that we discussed in class is the National 9/11 Pentagon Memorial, which was dedicated in 2008 and features 184 memorial units that each honor a victim of the plane crash. The orientation of these benches hold meaning. They signify whether these individuals were aboard Flight 77 or in the Pentagon at the time of the crash. And so you can see how some of these benches are facing different directions. These units evoke meaning and contribute to the overall landscape of the memorial. And the website says that these memorial units are dispersed throughout a tactile, sensory-driven environment, with all materials contributing to an emphasis on life. So these benches successfully create an environment conducive to reflection and community, which will be echoed in the Soldiers and Sailors intervention. The benches featured in We Dream a City will each be curved to form a staggered circle around the statue. In making these benches face the center of the circle, individuals are prompted to engage with one another, reflecting the monument's ideals of unity and equality. These benches will be 2 feet in depth and 1.5 feet in height. And so something that I really grappled with while designing my intervention was how to make sure that there was some sort of consistency between the design of the benches and the design of the monument. At first, when I was thinking of like benches and mosaics, I really wanted it to stand out and kind of make the space pop, just to bring attention to that space. And then in talking to a lot of different artists that work in public space and that work in mosaics, I realized that it is so important to make sure that kind of the historical nature of the monument really ties in seamlessly with the kind of more modern nature of the intervention and the benches and the mosaics. And so I'm going to talk about how I dealt with that a little bit. So together with the circular arrangement radiating outwards into Kennedy Plaza of the benches, the structure of the benches will seamlessly connect the statue to the broader space. The quotations on the longer curved side of each bench will echo the bronze lettering from the memorial, and I put a picture on the top right for you all to see. And then 1-inch indents on the memorial stone panels will also be featured on all 4 sides of the 8 benches, and this is on the bottom left. So all of these features in tandem really echo the older style of the monument while incorporating more engaging elements. And so I'm gonna go into a discussion on the mosaics a little bit, keeping in mind the idea of tying the space together. The mosaics atop each of the benches are really designed to bring color to the space without completely distracting from the monument's design. Like the other features of the benches, the color scheme of these mosaics will draw on the monument itself. The mosaics will successfully echo the greens, grays, and beiges from the rusted bronze and stone of the monument. And I kind of like drew out a little color scheme on the left, which I think really keeps those muted tones while also adding like a little bit of color to the space, as well as the green roofing of the Kennedy Plaza passenger terminal. And so if you've been to Kennedy Plaza, yeah, the roof is green, and just in general, that space has a lot of like muted green tones. And so I really wanted to keep that. The style and muted color scheme of the works of Millard Sheets, who was a California-based artist who frequently worked in mosaics, would be referenced in creating these curved mosaic panels. And so I just put a couple of examples here. And I think like this design and the style is really something that I wanted the benches to emulate. So stylistically, his mosaics serve as a bridge between the modern and the historic, which will be useful in connecting the mosaics to the classical style of the monument. Community engagement is the last thing that I'm going to talk about, and I think is really central to my intervention. Working with community members to collectively conceptualize a public art project allows for the public to design the spaces that they occupy. Sean Dunwoody is an artist who frequently works with murals, and a lot of his website kind of focuses on the importance of the process of community engagement. So I'm going to read a couple of quotes. First, he says, community design projects are founded on the idea that community participation is essential for the design decision-making process. And he also says that the mission is to give expression to ideas and perspectives that are underrepresented in the public dialogue. One of the best ways we've found to inspire creativity on a project is encouraging everyone to realize that anything is possible. And so I think that these goals expressed by these 2 quotes, which really give a voice to the underrepresented and encourage them to see themselves in public space, are crucial in thinking about monuments and public space. This holds particularly true for children who can actually grow up knowing that they've had an impact on their community and its public space. So I think that idea of defining public space instead of like having public space define you was really interesting. I've identified 3 middle schools and 1 community center that I think would be really ideal for my project. So the 3 middle schools are Del Sesto Middle School, Roger Williams Middle School, and Gilbert Stewart Middle School. And I chose these 3 because they're all involved in a program called Turnaround Arts Providence, which is an organization that implements after-school artistic programming for students, like musical and theater productions. So the fact that these 3 schools are already involved with creative programming, I think will just make it more feasible to facilitate mosaic design workshops, since they already have experience in these types of workshops. The Southside Community Center is actually involved in similar work. Their website shares that they envision a vibrant, connected community engaged in discovering, exploring, and creating art that nurtures the voices of artists of color and cultivates leaders who lift up our people. So I think that I really chose these 4 groups because their missions really do align with the mission of my intervention. And so I really like that about each of them. So one-day workshops would be held for each of these groups to collectively reflect on the poem and personal meanings of equality. And these 2 pictures that I'm showing right now, the one on the left is a picture from Turnaround Arts, and the one on the right is a picture from the Southside Cultural Center, just to help show what some of these workshops would actually look like in practice. So the community members would design preliminary mosaic panels during these workshops. Using construction paper to design the mosaics is a really practical way of engaging the community. And when I was speaking with artists who work in mosaics, they said that this is like a common practice for people who want to engage the community, is kind of just designing it on like construction paper and then like having the artist actually go in and make it themselves. So then the paper pieces would then be further planned and created by the artist. The design process would not only serve as an academic and artistic experience for the children and the community members, but would also really allow them to play a role in cultivating public space in their own city, and they'd be able to literally dream a city of their own. And so, yeah, thank you for listening.
Hey, thank you all for those really fantastic papers today. Really appreciate Noah. Everyone, if you will come back on camera so we can see you, Noah, Ciara, and Miya. Thank you very much. for your attention actually to the larger themes of the class. I think we have a couple questions here. I have a couple to ask of you, but I'll hold off because we have time clearly. But I see we have a couple questions. So one from Eugenia Marks wants to know, do you plan to present these ideas for revitalization and innovation of monuments in Providence to the city through the council or to the mayor, Elorza? Avery, Ciara, and Noah, what do you think? Or would you think about submitting your designs, or Noah?
I think that it would be great to have not just these designs, but sort of more designs that come from a grassroots perspective. I think that monuments and memorials, there's like a real inherent tension just because they have to represent sort of vernacular and grassroots sentiment, but more often than not, they're only possible from the top down. So I think that it would sort of, I think I want to see monument building move in a direction that is sort of more grassroots, whether that's from Brown students or from members of the broader Providence community.
Do you want to respond to that, Avery?
Yeah, so I kind of like through my research, I talked to like a lot of people. I think one person I found who was actually worked in mosaics in Providence. And so it was just, I don't know, I like probably not, but it was just really cool to know that, I don't know, these projects are actually something that like could feasibly be done. But yeah, probably not.
But why did you decide on community engagement as part of your project, Avery? Like, what did you see in the value? I mean, you say it, but what motivated you? Because in the beginning we talked about this and you weren't quite sure. So what got you there to the notion of community engagement?
I don't know. I thought that, so I knew I wanted to talk about equality. And so I think, I don't know. I think it's really meaningful to talk about equality and like have broader conversations about it too, instead of just having an artist kind of think about it themselves. And then I think at one point I was thinking of having an artist like ask for feedback from the community on what equality means. And then I found the poem and then it kind of just all came together in a nice way. I don't know. I think it just happened by chance. But I knew that I wanted to kind of engage more voices, like thinking about equality than like just one artist.
Well, and Miya, I think that's really important to your project too. Like both Miya and Ciara. And well, one thing that courses, and I'll get back to the questions that I was really interested, like hearing you all actually say this out loud now. And there's a very long question that I'll read, but in a minute. But that reflection is so central to each one of these projects. The idea that one enters space to do reflection about the past. And I'm wondering if each of you could talk a little bit but for work in the future, like that's also what I understood your projects to be about, that it's not just that you're reflecting on the past, but actually, as I think Noah, this notion of the grassroots sentiment, like where do we go forward? So Miya, I was really pleased to see that in your work.
Yeah, I think a main sort of issue with at least my memorial and a lot of the other memorials that we've looked at is just like the disconnect between this like huge piece of public art and then sort of the people who actually live there and use that space and pass by it every day. And so I think like I really wanted to find a way to really directly like bring the people who use this space into the space rather than just having this kind of like a movable object that you just look at and can't really engage with.
And Ciara, you as well, right? The kind of resistance to a big monument or a big piece of bronze sculpture.
Yes, and I think like something that we talked a lot about class and even within national conversation today is that the idea that these monuments live beyond people. And I think like that it's important because these values and beliefs are the things that get spread into the future. And so when thinking about how we want to shape like the future and what's coming now, I think there is this way that in order to reconcile with the past, but do it in a way that is honest and truthful. And I feel like a lot of these monuments don't do it in a way that is honest and truthful and tells the correct narrative. And so I think this idea of like reflection within monument building requires a new like rendering of the truth that we would all like collectively to be present in the future.
And Noah, do you have anything more to say about reflection? I was really struck about walking like into the ground. And in some ways you've taken Maya Lin and you've inserted it deep into the ground, right? The Maya Lin Vietnam Veterans Memorial, but the process of actually moving through that space of being underground, then to come out into the light. I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit about that transformation from being like deep down to being out in the natural environment.
Yeah. So I thought that something that we sort of talked about in the course was sort of really the invisibility of a lot of monuments and public art. There was like a quote that was like, there's nothing more invisible than like a plaque in a public space, just because they're so ubiquitous that they end up getting ignored. So I really wanted to focus on something that was like experiential and really, I guess, required like a certain level of engagement on the viewer's part that sort of couldn't be like passively taken. So I think that creating this sort of like corridor allowed for like, I guess I really required like a level of like investment in order to access that space. So that sort of recognizing that it's not something that sort of has to like can happen casually, but rather it's something that really requires like moving into sort of this like serious, like contemplative, reflective space. Because it's a really huge sort of crime and a stain on both the history of Providence and Rhode Island and also our nation. And I think it's not the kind of thing that sort of is like appropriate to I guess like look at in passing, you know, like it really, it requires you to be all in, I guess. So that was on my mind.
Well, and Sean Sipperstein has a question, but I was struck by how this idea, I think you used the phrase not look away. And I think, Ciara, your project is about not looking away. I think, and so is Maya's, right? Not to look away from this long history. And then how is it that we are situated in relationship to the AIDS crisis, right? And so, Avery, you are too, in a way that you're asking for different kind of notions of what equality looks like, not to just have the words, but to actually how is it enacted, the notion of equality in public space. I think, Avery, that's what it seems to me, using both the Langston Hughes poems, but the Mosaic Benches do some of that.
Yeah, I think also really allowing the public to like actually play a role in it. Because I know like when I was walking by, I used to take the bus from Kennedy Plaza like all the time last year. And I never actually, like, I never thought about the monument being there. Like it was just kind of there. And so I think like giving people the opportunity and the chance, I guess, to like think about it more deeply and like question like what the monument is actually kind of standing for, and then like just reflect on it.
So you're all asking for a pause, actually, from the public to actually pause and engage. So let me read you this question here. It says, each of these thoughtful interventions propose making these monuments engaged by essentially requiring something more of the public, not just contemplating a statue, a plaque, or space, but asking for a more sustained engagement. And I think you can all agree that that's what you're doing. That's what we've been talking about. And was this a deliberate choice or any of your parts to break with the past style of memorialization? Do you see assuring continued engagement with your intended purposes as a challenge? Thinking about public attention span. So was this a deliberate choice? And I think it was, but I'd be curious what you each, like this deliberate choice to really create this active space, right?
I think in class we studied a lot of monuments that we would have otherwise not have engaged with at all if it wasn't for the class. And so I think it was interesting because we talked a lot about monuments and their problems like artistically, their problems sustainability wise, and like their problems just in the greater context of truth telling and the values and beliefs that get uplifted and the power in which they hold within spaces. And so I think that was a big, at least from speaking on my behalf, and like I think a lot of the other interventions, it was this idea of like, how do we move beyond something that it brings people in more and invites people in than it being like an exclusionary public art, which I think a lot of the monuments that we studied were very exclusionary. They weren't accessible to the public. They weren't accessible even to some of the identities that they were supposed to value, which was something that at least I wanted to make sure like that intention of that, who this monument is for and the people that is for and the people that holds at the core are feel the most welcomed and feel the most represented, but at the same time allow everyone else to engage in that conversation. And so, like Noah mentioned, this idea of visibility, but also this idea of accessibility. And I think playing with nature in the most purest form offers that accessibility in a way that a lot of other monuments didn't or couldn't have.
Thank you, Ciara. Well put. Noah, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think that I really I had this sort of question in my process that was like really difficult, which was sort of like, how do you address something that really people see from so many different ends of that experience in the context of slavery and the slave trade, and people need like just like really different things, like the whether that's sort of education or sort of for people who have sort of been allowed to forget sort of the magnitude of these crimes, like sort of a reminder of like how real this was, and sort of the repercussions and the ramifications, and how these things live on, and also for people that need healing and live every day with these reminders and sort of don't need these wounds to be reopened. So I think that I hope that we move in a direction where memorialization, and I think we are, like sort of from Maya Lin sort of on, I think there's really been a pivot and a shift towards experience and sort of understanding not just what things communicate in their aesthetic ramifications, but also like really with experience, and sort of how does a memorial or a monument provide a need and sort of speak to the need of the community in a way that is really meaningful. Yeah.
And I thought, Noah, you mentioned that word healing, Miya. That's so much to me. It's so much a part of your project, about the notion that healing can also happen in that grove and is not just about the corporate sponsor. Like, I think you're trying to attend to this like lack of access that happens in the grove in San Francisco, if I understand your project correctly.
Yeah, I think sort of going there, what I noticed is that like this is already kind of a community gathering space, and it feels weird because the people gathering there aren't necessarily conscious of kind of the greater impact of the space or the greater implications of what it's trying to do. And so I think like ideally it can be a place like for healing for people who have lost someone to come and remember and kind of do that publicly, and also for people who are already gathering there. I mentioned this in class, but like people were having birthday parties, sort of it's half mourners and half people just hanging out. And I think if sort of we can honor the mourners and also call those visitors in, I think it could be like a really transformative experience for those two groups of people to really connect in the same location.
Thank you very much. Now I see, and I think this is my colleague Karen Lemmy, who's showing up as someone else by accident, but she says, thank you to Ciara, Miya, Noah, and Avery. What thoughtful presentations, beautifully done. So Avery, she has a very specific question for you. And she says, can you talk a bit more about how you negotiated the tensions inherent in attempting to create a dynamic, community-based monument around the ideas? Oh, that is actually, Grace just texted me. This is Grace Yasamura asking you the question, and not, sorry about that. So Grace Yasamura has this question and says, well done to all of you. And she says, can you talk a little bit about how you negotiate the tensions inherent in attempting to create a dynamic, community-based monument around the ideas of unity and equity with an existing monument that centers the U.S. military, a driving force in the maintenance of racial hierarchy in the American empire?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's something that I thought about a lot. And I think I don't know. It's really difficult. It's challenging because there's so many different like memorials. I think in downtown Providence too, like I did a little walk around, and there's so many different memorials and monuments that kind of speak to like just war veterans. And I know there was one on the Burnside statue. And so when I was doing my research, somebody who came to our class to speak, I forgot their name, but they did an intervention on the Burnside statue, I believe.
That was Becky the Providence-based artist, Becky Davis.
Yeah. And so I think it wasn't I really like the way that they kind of faced it with not necessarily like removing the monument, but kind of like adding your own. I think they had like art or into it. Yeah. So I really like that idea. And I think just kind of an intervention in itself is like questioning the original purpose of why it was put up. And so I think in this way, like questioning like how equality can play, or how equality and the military are like oftentimes they just oppose each other. And so I think that was kind of how I addressed it, by looking at it and kind of examining its purpose in the first place, and kind of putting something around it just adding something to it to question it. I think that's such a good question. I probably could have done it a little bit better, but.
Well, no, what Avery, I also wonder about the fact is that they're supposed to be in the act also of acknowledging the United States colored troops on that monument, but they're not present, and so that's a really interesting, right, thing.
Yeah, because I know we looked at, I'm forgetting the name of all these monuments, and I'm so sorry. But the one in Boston Commons, I think, that was the first monument that actually like featured
the Robert Coleshaw,
that actually featured like Black people and like Black features. That did not exist at all in the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. And so I think just like questioning, even though there's a plaque, like why aren't any of these people actually representative of the people that are like Black people? And yeah.
So there's another question, which I think is David Mitchell, who I think was in our class, but I'm going to ask it. He asked Ciara, will you consider reaching out to Brown University to find a way to include your acknowledgement guard on campus? I believe it's a brilliant idea.
Yes, I would love to find a way to reach out. I know I've given a similar presentation and work with decolonization at Brown. He does a lot of work with the removal of like Roman and white supremacist statues and just holding different conversations around it. And there is a current conversation about like what to do with the Caesar Augustus statue. And the current conversations that they want to like move it to another place, but at least my opinion on it is that just redistributes and relocates harm, and so there needs to be more done when it comes to that. But I would definitely love to bring it to Brown in any way possible to kind of start that conversation.
And I think your monument so effectively pulls in the indigenous stories and spaces, right, of that labyrinth that or the garden design based in the turtle, right, that you used as well. That's truly exciting. So I think that there's a comment here from Karen Lemmy, and I'll get a text if this is right or wrong, if I'm identifying the right person. It says, such a range of ideas, poetry, community engagement, audio, movement, the making of really worthy proposals. I really appreciate how each of you shared examples of existing monuments and discussed the various attributes and shortcomings. So she asked, do you have any thoughts on temporary monuments, right? So we did talk about this a little bit in class, about temporary monuments, or like the ephemeral monument. Or is it presumed permanence of a monument is essential to its function? So do you believe in like the idea of an impermanent, of the ephemeral monument? Or is the presumed permanence of a monument essential to its function, especially as these proposals address something long overlooked? Like, do we need permanence because these stories have not been told?
I can begin.
Yes, no, please.
Yeah. So with mine, I thought about the imagery of sinking, and I sort of thought about invoking permanence. So very, very often within not as much memorialization, but in really the monumental landscape, permanence is something that's sort of, it's really, people make a strong effort to communicate that and just sort of like sort of project dominance or power or sovereignty through these sort of interventions in the landscape. And I thought about using that in the sort of in an inverted way, and rather than sort of bringing in an expression of power, thinking about how I could use permanence as bringing in sort of like a permanent mark of shame. So rather than sort of a certain leader or a certain president or a certain king sort of remaining within the landscape, thinking about how I could take this imagery of something that was, it's really shameful, of sort of the imagery of the auction block, and how I could make that something that like doesn't go away, and maybe becomes less visible, but is not something that we can sort of easily get rid of, even if we wanted to. So I think that even though I definitely like involve myself within that permanence, I think that I come at it in a very different way than I think that it has historically been looked at.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Anybody else on this idea of permanence versus?
I guess I don't think a monument necessarily has to be permanent for it to be effective. I think certainly with my intervention, I don't intend for it to be in that space forever. Like the technology will become outdated, the design will become outdated. And what I was based it on, these sort of booths that were in the Bronx, are no longer there anymore. And I think for me, even though like I always want there to be some sort of active memorialization going on in that space to honor these people, I also think that kind of the needs of a community change over time, and the idea that a monument has to reflect the values of a community forever is a little bit unreasonable. I think we saw that come up a lot when we were discussing Confederate monuments, that people really are up in arms that we would sort of tear down something that is meant to last forever. Sort of as we've studied in this class, people take down monuments all the time, and the values and ideals of a community are constantly changing. So I think it's okay for monuments to change, and if someone else has another intervention that they want to bring into this same space, I would love to see something like that. I think that sort of we should be constantly trying to, I guess, adapt to what the community really needs from our public spaces, and however monuments play into that in terms of permanence. I think that's great.
You know, Mia, I really appreciate that, because I can't imagine, you know, with the technology, that yours might be something that goes in and it has this real community engagement and people responding and submitting, and then maybe it's over in 6 months or a year, right? Or the technology changed, or the sound boost got rained out on, or something like that, right? But that it has this moment, so then it lives within all those people who participated in your project, right? If it were to be in that space. So we have a question from Catherine Imes that says, thank you for your awesome projects. Speaking of mourning and healing, did you experience moments of grief as you worked on these projects? And she writes, I got emotional just hearing about them. I'm actually interested in this question too. Did you feel grief or anger? One might even say it doesn't have to be grief or anger or disbelief as you were working on your projects. Or some emotional response?
I think for mine, I think it was rooted, at least for my intervention, and I think a lot of ours, like we really talk a lot about, at least the ones that are based in Providence, who talk a lot about this history that goes unnoticed, this history that people don't really ever talk about, and this history that somehow our being a part in this university and the way in which we move into Providence plays a huge interaction with it. And so I think like delving deep into the harm, and I guess the harm of land and the harm of people. And I talked a lot to some students who are part of the Narragansett tribe, and just how much it means for like just that figure to be there, and like for them to walk across campus and experience that. And then Harambe, that was just one of the archives that I found. And there were so many other handwritten notes and just images and pictures and like journal of, and like newsletters of just all of the harm that people had to go just for them, for their own value and identity to be recognized on campus. And so I feel like I felt a lot of anger, at least for me. And so it was hard to, how do I create something that's supposed to be intended for healing and peace when I'm just constantly like upset about like how this can still be congested today. And I think through that process of like physically designing the garden, like I felt peace with myself and at peace with like these identities will one day, like it's starting to have conversation now, and I think like the process is slower than like what a lot of us would like it to be. But I think like through the process of creating the intervention, I kind of like reconcile with my own feelings and emotions about it. But I think it's important to know like that sometimes, even like if say our interventions were to be created, like that moment of grief and mourning could also be rose out of just our own interventions, because it's a history that has been like tied down and compact for people not to feel. And so I think when you have something that forces that out of people, like it's going to be a wave of emotions.
Thank you for that, Ciara. I appreciate your honesty. Yes, Noah.
Yeah, definitely like doing my research for this project was like very difficult. I looked through like a lot of like colonial newspapers that had a lot of like content that was like very upsetting. And that, of course, like as someone whose like ancestors were not directly affected, like I'm comparatively like removed, and I was like, it was still very, very difficult to like look through all this. And I think that Ciara makes it's spot on, like the point that she made. I think that so many of these things are omitted or hidden, and then they go unprocessed. You know, like when people don't have to confront these things, and they don't have to see these things, and they sort of like they're suppressed or they're hidden. People aren't able to process them, and really, when they do come, it's a lot to handle all at once. So I think the point you made was definitely very true.
Yeah, I would say like I spoke a lot with my mother while I was doing this project and visited the Grove with her, just because I think being a young person from San Francisco during this like particular period of time, like she lost like 25 people that she was close to, and I think sort of and getting to hear her stories brought up a lot for me. And I think sort of I noticed an interesting, I guess, angle to my grief or emotional response, just in like how much the erasure of this history is connected to gentrification. Because when I was talking to like my friends from high school, I think I really only had one friend whose parents were even from like San Francisco or from the Bay Area, instead of a lot of the people I went to school with, parents moved into the city like during the dot-com boom. And so like this generation of people who are living here and experiencing this, like most people don't live in the city anymore and don't really access this space at all. And so seeing how much that's contributed to just like forgetting how localized this crisis was, I think was really haunting for me.
Yeah, I think when I was looking into my monument, I think I got emotional, I think, looking into it and looking into the actual backstory and how histories were erased by kind of just like propping up this like soldiers and sailors monument and saying like unity is restored, because obviously that's not the case even like in segregation in Providence today. And so I think I didn't necessarily get emotional when I first saw the monument when I was just walking by it, and I think that's why I really wanted to kind of look into it and like make people feel emotional when they saw it, I guess, or at least just like make people reflect on it. And so I think with what Ciara and Noah were saying about histories being erased, and different like perspectives and groups not really having a say in this like public space and like in what the monument means, unless you actually kind of like do the work and like look into it, I think that idea is something that kind of made me emotional more than the actual monument itself.
So thank you for all the responses. I do remember when Ciara came, we had conversations about her archival finds. And I remember when you showed me the the letter of the young woman with the racial slur, and I had an emotional response to that. I felt, that there was both anger, but also a real thinking, like that kind of harm is really hard as a young person on a college campus. And how do you navigate that kind of racism that she experienced, right, of the snowballs and the use of the N-word against her. And so I remember you showing me that archival document, and then thinking like, how is she going to do this intervention? I mean, with this evidence that she's acquiring. So I do think the idea that for certain of these projects, the mourning and grief are very much part of them, but there's also something that you're trying to do beyond the mourning and grief, I think. And that to me is this deep reflection that is at the root of all your projects. So we're at the end of the time. If you had questions for one question for each other, or if we can wrap this up, I very much appreciate you agreeing to present today and to share your work and the hard work that you did in the course over the semester and thinking about monuments and memory and history. And it's interesting to hear you talk about the class. We talked a lot about who's excluded. Like this was a refrain throughout the semester about whose stories are told and whose stories are neglected in monumental space. So thank you all, and thank you to the attendees for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate your presence and the ability for Avery, Ciara, Noah, and Miya to share their work with you today. So Catherine, is there anything else I need to do to wrap this up?
No, thank you to all the students. That was so fabulous. And thank you to the audience who asked questions.
Mm-hmm. So thank you, and you all have a good evening. And I'll be in touch with the four students, of course. But to the rest of you, thank you for your presence. We really appreciate it. Okay, good evening.